Good morning, good evening, depending upon what part of the world you're in. If it's Friday, it is the CEO series where we bring together most inspiring leaders, entrepreneurs, innovators from across the globe, and they share their career journey. And today, we are honored to have Ken Brotherston, who's a very dear friend, who's the founder and chair of Taliant Partners, based out of UK. It's global as well as the Middle East. Vast experience in successfully running and building global businesses across the TA and recruitment ecosystem. He chairs the talent partner business and also focuses on creating exceptional insight and experience from the employer community. Over 30 years experience, including board positions at Robert Walters, Korn Ferry International, Morgan McKinley, and as well as Fidelity Investment. He's also served on the Recruitment and Development Committee at Oxfam for 7 years until 2024. And with that, I welcome my friend.
Thank you. Good to see you, Ron.
Good to see you. I was saying earlier, the last time Ken and I were together, he invited me to speak at the London Business School webinar, whatever it was, and that was years ago. So it's good to see you again. This has been a while.
Very good.
So one of the key points of the CEO series and what we try and accomplish is talking about people's careers. So walk us through your career paths to where you are today, board positions, and all those kinds of things. So kind of give us some insight as it relates to that.
Sure, I'll give you a gallop because it's been a long road, so I'll try and cover it quickly. I mean, I grew up in Glasgow in the west of Scotland from a very working class environment. My mum worked in a shop. My dad was a tool store foreman at Rolls-Royce. I was the first in my family to go to university. And I actually went when I was 16 to study electronic engineering. And there are two lessons in there that have influenced my life. One was I was far too young to go to university. And also I went to study something I didn't really enjoy. I wasn't particularly interested in. It was teachers and family who thought that engineering and electronic engineering should be the thing to do. So I bounced out of that after a couple of years, and then managed to get a job as an accountant with Procter & Gamble, and had moved to England, and realised after a couple of years doing that, I would only ever be a very average accountant. And I wanted to try something more sales-oriented. And a lot of people fall into recruitment. I actually made a specific decision to come into recruitment because it was using my accountancy knowledge, but in a much more sales environment. And I found something at the age of 23 that I really enjoyed. And that gave me real confidence once I'd found something that I knew I could do and do it reasonably well. So I had a fairly successful career in recruiting. I was on the board of Robert Walters at a relatively young age. I then stepped out of that and spent 2 years with Fidelity Investments as HR director as part of their European brokerage business, which was really interesting, absolutely fascinating organization. It was like an MBA in HR, but ultimately I missed the commercial aspect of that. And I then joined Korn Ferry, the world's biggest executive search firm, and had about 7 or 8 years with them. Ended up on their global operating committee. So one of the sort of half a dozen or so people that ran the firm worldwide back then. And again, did some really interesting things with them, helping to build what we called an internet business back then.
Back in the day.
Yeah, we'll touch on some of the echoes of that, I'm sure, later in our conversation.
Yeah.
And then I guess by that point, I'd decided, although I reported to the chairman of Korn Ferry, and I guess, was still relatively young and would have had a shot at that job at some point, but I didn't want it. And I decided to try something more entrepreneurial and started working with some private equity firms, mainly to take recruitment and sort of human capital services that were broken, struggling, and trying to turn around. And I did that with varying degrees of success, some big successes and some not so successful. until about 10 years ago, I found myself as chairman of a recruitment technology business. And that was a really interesting business, but it had got a bit stuck in terms of its position in the market. And it had a interesting sideline in events that I quite enjoyed. So I gave them a little bit of money for that and took the events activity off to one side and created TALiNT Partners in 2017. And, the goal with TALiNT Partners was to create, we talk about an insights business. So it's not pure research. It's more around, practical insight into how everyone involved in the talent ecosystem can either work with employers to help build, find and keep the people they need, or for a vendor community to help them build better businesses. So that's been an interesting journey over the last few years.
That's amazing. I mean, starting out, I'm going to do engineering. Nope, that's not working. I'm going to do accounting. No, this is not my sweet spot. And then I'm going to go into corporate, and I rise to the level of Coin Ferry, that's the level. And then you decided to pull out and start something else. So at each one of those points, you were bouncing back, bouncing back. Was there a key theme, or was it just I'm not getting the satisfaction, or I want to move and do something else?
It was. I look back and there was a inordinate level of drive. I think psychologists call it an away from strategy.
Okay.
And it's very powerful. It's not always a good thing, but it's a very powerful mindset, which is, I don't care what happened just today. I have to be somewhere else, tomorrow. And I had that to quite a high degree, which meant I was kind of relentless. But also that meant impatient. And, and I look back now and some decisions were great and some decisions were not so great. And sometimes I got to things too early. Sometimes I was, way too hasty to do things. But I guess it just gave me that sort of, continuous momentum to keep trying to do new things. And if I got stuck, I wasn't afraid to turn left or turn right to try and do something different.
Okay, a key word I wasn't afraid, because lots of times, you talk to people, I'm sure you talk to people in career decisions they're trying to make, and they're afraid to move forward. They're afraid because they're in constant this area and everything is taken care of, but I really want to do something else. How would you coach someone who's in that stage and they're afraid to make a move?
Yeah. I asked them what's the worst that could happen. And really drill into that and say, okay, well, what's the worst that could happen? And if they get to the worst that can happen and they can accept that, then what's stopping you? That kind of gives you the freedom to make that decision. And this kind of goes back to when I discovered recruitment. I thought, well, this is something I can do forever, right? So always when I was faced with a decision and I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? It's like, well, I'll go back to doing recruitment. And I thought, you know what, I enjoyed doing that and it gave me a good living. So if that's the worst that can happen, then I'll give it a go. And if I fall, I'm only falling to a level that I know I'm not uncomfortable with. So that was my situation. Now, obviously, as you get older and, you get married and you have children and you have, that decision gets a bit more complex. But it just gave me a framework to think about how I, would make decisions.
So the recruiting side and starting that, you felt comfortable in trying to help people to move to. So how do you feel you were going to compete, because they've got a lot of recruitment agencies, recruiters, and all this kind of thing? But having worked from Korn Ferry, that give you the better insight, or how did you feel comfortable moving into recruitment after you'd gone through different phases of it?
I mean, it took me to get comfortable with it. Probably took me a good 12 to 18 months to think, actually, I can, I'm competent at this, and I met an HR director of what was a big business, a big services business, one time outside, and I was still in my 20s. He was much older, and he said, you know what, people in recruitment, they don't realize the job that they've got and just how interesting it is. You know, a lot of them are in it for the money. That they're not really paying attention to the insights it can give you and the richness of it. And I've always believed that. I've always believed it's a really, really interesting job if you take the time to do it well and do it properly. So I think because of that, I've never been bad at it, you know, because I find it interesting, and I find, you know, understanding people's motivations and their drivers, and you know, as we all know, you know, changing jobs is one of the big three decisions. You know, the partner you have, the house you buy, the job you take. So it's a really fascinating point to deal with people when they're going through that process. And I've always found that, and I still find that. You know, it's interesting.
Okay, so we had a conversation. We've had this conversation before, and you know, people try and seek their passion. And I want you to kind of walk us through that, because one of the things that you've told me offline was the fact that, you know,
Yeah.
you play in a band, you know, and that's my passion. Walk us through that dynamic of passion and really, really doing what you really enjoy doing.
Yeah. So some of the team that I work with now will have heard me say this, that when we talk about how we behave at work, I'm not a big fan of the word passion. I'm a big fan of, you know, commitment and dedication and perseverance and hard work and caring but you know, passion for me in business is not necessarily a healthy thing. It's illogical, and I think it drives you to make bad decisions.
Okay.
Playing in a band is completely illogical and makes no sense whatsoever. You know, you spend all day traveling to a gig and 5 hours setting up and sitting around doing nothing and 5 hours driving home. But for those 90 minutes that you're playing, it makes everything worth it. But it's not in any sense a logical way to spend your time. But it is something that I feel quite passionate about. So for me, they're two different things. You know, you can be hugely committed to your career and your job, but I think passion isn't always great for that. But outside of that, the team you support, the sport you do, the music you love, you know, whatever, be as passionate as you like about stuff like that.
Okay, cool. I love that. John Self, who's a frequent listener, who's also in executive search, he posted a question here. It says, how does the current recruiting model overcome the stats? I think you can see it here. A 40% of placements are 18 months. Short lifespan. 75-year-old model. What would be your thought to John's statement?
I think I would actually challenge the underlying premise that it's a horrible statistic, because even with the sophistication of assessment processes now, it's still very hard to hire the right person, and that's at any stage in their career. So if you're getting it right 60% of the time, you're actually not doing too badly. You know, if you look at, I don't normally like sporting analogies, but if you look at the English Premiership Football League, it's one of the most richest franchises in sports. And if you look at the turnover of the team managers, it's incredible. You know, the number that get fired within 2 years, it's something like 50 or 60%.
Really?
And these are people who are spending huge amounts of money to try and find the right person. So if they can't do it, what hope is there for anyone else? So I think the key to when someone doesn't work out is to act quickly.
Okay.
You know, it's not to try and get from 60% to 70% to 80%. I'm just not convinced that that's possible. I think the key is to support them as much as they possibly can. And if they don't work out, they don't work out. Make the decision quickly and then recognize that it didn't work out and move on.
Mm. Interesting comment, because when we look at that, and I always go through from an HR side, internal versus external. The external lifespan is about 18 months, which is said here. So a lot of the key points in human resources today is about internal development. So kind of give me your thoughts as because you played a role as an HR director for Fidelity.
Yeah.
Um, External, do we go out and do it from here, or do we concentrate on trying to build it inside?
Yeah, and we see this with the work we do with employers today. There's been a real sea change
Yeah.
in how they think about their internal talent compared to external, and that's long overdue. That really is long overdue. Having said that, their culture and processes in many organisations is a huge barrier to
Okay.
affecting good internal mobility. And one of the tests when I'm with a group of employers, I'll often say to them is, you know, is it as easy for me to apply for a job internally in your organization as it is externally? And most of them go, yeah, it's as easy. And I'll say, okay, do I have to tell anyone? And they'll go, well, you do need to tell your manager. And I said, well, you've just failed at the first fence, right? Because
Exactly.
I
Out.
don't need to do that, but I understand that the culture and processes can be a barrier to that. But we're seeing those change, and in the last couple of years in particular, there's been a very rapid change in organizations finally recognizing that if you're of a medium size or large size, the likelihood is the person you need to fill the role is already in your business.
Exactly.
And yeah, they're getting far better at finding them. And a big part of that was driven by the post-pandemic spike in hiring.
It was.
And I think there's other forces at work now to embed that mindset even more. But
Mm,
it's been a long time coming.
mm. So you talk about the fortitude. I go back to the decisions you made. Some worked out, some didn't work out, but you kind of had this mindset that I'm going to keep trying for. Where did that come from? Was that from your upbringing, or you got to keep trying? If it doesn't work out, it's cool. Just keep trying, keep moving on.
Um, this is going to sound terrible. One of the inspirations, in many ways, for what I've done is my mum, because my mum was a very, very capable woman. But she didn't really achieve much in her career.
Yeah, yeah.
But she would say things like, "Well, I could have done that. I could have done that." And I remember thinking at quite a young age, maybe teenager, thinking, "I don't want to say that. I don't want to be the
I
person that
could
says,
have. Yeah,
yeah, I want to, try it and see what happens, and if it works, it works." And
yeah.
um, so that's a kind of reverse inspiration, if you like. But it's been something that I've been aware of for a long time. And then I think in terms of the perseverance, I don't know. I mean, when I was younger, my sport was running marathons, and just it tended to be. And anyone can run a marathon. You just got to put one foot in front of the other and ignore the pain.
That sounds
And
easy. That sounds easy. Okay.
it's not easy. It isn't, but anyone can do it. You've
Yeah,
just got to be willing
yeah,
to
yeah.
go through that pain barrier. So I think having I think I've always had a when I put my mind to something, a reasonable degree of perseverance.
You could move it beyond that. Yeah, my situation was the same. I worked for Martha Stewart. I told you the story behind it. And my mother, when I got the job there, and she says, I don't see the big deal. She's like, because my mother was a baker. She baked every day. Every day she baked. So when you came home, nothing came from the store. Nothing came from the
Mm,
store. So when I got a job there, she said, I look at this stuff. She said, I can do all of that. I said, it's totally different. You can do all of this in here, but can you do it to the level that it's out and you got a product and you all
mm,
behind all those kind of things. So it was kind of the same kind of concept, in doing that. So how do you get outside of the expertise you have that you may keep it in counts here, but I want to get out and I want to sell the world about what we're trying to do. So I want to start some questioning concerning, you've learned from things and you've learned and you've cataloged things and you put it together and now you're moving into a kind of a different space. How much has mentoring had worked inside of your career?
Um, I mean, when you say that, I've not had, I guess, what I call long term mentors,
Okay.
but just when you ask the question, two names come to mind, right? We had a guy called Jim Wilson and a woman called Cindy Cotman, who were two bosses that I had, and they were incredibly just wise and supportive people, and they were really useful to me at certain points in my career. And Jim was at Fidelity. And he looked he looked a bit like the old the cartoon character Yosemite Sam. He had this big old moustache like this,
Yeah.
and he just had great advice. And then Cindy Cotman was my boss at Corn Ferry, and she was an absolute powerhouse. And I can remember her walking into a partners meeting, and there's 20 partners, and I think 2 women, one of which is her. And she just owned the room. She just had such confidence.
Yeah.
But confidence if someone asked her a question, she would say, "I don't know." Or if someone said a word that she didn't, she'd say, "I don't know what that word means." And she wasn't aggressive or showy. She would just say, "I don't know what that word means. Can you tell me what that word means?" And I sometimes wondered that she actually did know what the word meant. She was just showing to that audience that she was so confident about her own self that she could just show what would be a weakness or a perceived weakness. And actually, it was a huge strength. So she's someone that I think gave me some great advice over the years as well.
I don't know. When I do leadership development, I always use that phrase. I said that the most important phrase a leader can use is to say, "I don't know. Let's figure it out together." As opposed to coming in the old mindset. We go back to the old mindset. The old mindset says, "I'm the answer person. I got everything figured out. You ask me, I got a solution for everything. Stop it."
But you know what? There's a balance, though. I think it is important to be able to say, "I don't know."
Yeah.
But there are times where it's absolutely vital to say, "I do know." And even if you don't, by the way, and the pandemic would be one where you just have to demonstrate a kind of confidence that we're going to get through this.
Yeah.
And we're that leadership is only leadership when it's hard. Leadership when things are going well isn't leadership. It's only leadership when it's hard. And that's when sometimes people, when no one knows, they want to look to someone that they trust, hopefully, and they can say, "Look, I think this is the right direction, so let's kind of head that way."
Yeah, so it's like put on cruise control. Everything is cool, and I'm just kind of guiding along. Everything is cool, and then you hit a bump or a detour, and that's where the leadership component comes in. So how are you taking this forward with everything that you've learned over your career, the trajectory of your career? How are you paying this forward? And that could be, you mentioned the 2 people that had an impact on you, which I always find interesting because when you ask people a question, certain names pop up. And I've always said I would want to be the person that said, "I worked for this guy," and it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure I've had my fair share of both camps, right? Hopefully more in the positive camp than the negative, but yeah.
So how are you packaging all of that and carrying it forward and developing other leaders inside of your organization, or either someone just reaches out to you and need coach, mentor, whatever you would want to call it?
I think you try to set a good example, I think is the first thing, and for me that means two things: trust and fairness. Be someone that people can trust, and be someone that they think is fair. I think most reasonable people understand that leadership is about making difficult decisions and making decisions that not everyone is going to like. But if they trust you and they think that you're trying to be fair, I think that's a really important part of it. And the other thing is I'd like to think that I try and be generous with my time. So if someone takes the time to ask me a question, I'll genuinely try and and give them, a considered and thoughtful response, and just be helpful. And because I remember the people that have done that with me. I
Yeah.
remember the ones that didn't, by the
Yeah.
way. But I remember the ones that did,
Yeah.
and I'd like, I try and be the person that will give some time.
So we were talking about the good managers that you remember things from, and you kind of alluded to it. So I found, and this is doing my career, I found that I learned a lot also from bad managers because I
Oh yeah,
knew I never ever wanted to be perceived as that. And
yeah.
I wanted to be more open in connecting to people that they didn't feel as if they could just walk into the office and talk or whatever it would be to do that. So, kind of give us your insights on the bad managers and what we can learn from people
And
that
you're
we
right.
we
If
may not align to in some way.
Yeah, and if you're paying attention, you do get a lot of great guidance from bad managers in terms of
Yeah.
what not to do. I mentioned Cindy Cotman earlier, and I remember one of the things that she said to me. She said, people often take on the habits of their bad managers.
Mm,
So even though you're complaining about, your manager has a certain way of doing things that you really don't like, it's surprising how often you can end up taking on that same thing. And when she said that to me, I kind of stored it away. And actually, I've tried not to be that person,
yeah.
with some success. I'm sure not all the time, but you do see it in other people where they end up taking on the behaviour of something that they were they really don't like. So that was, if someone can think about that and hold that phrase in their head now, hopefully that will be useful for them in the years ahead.
Okay. In your role, well, in your past role, as you're seeking out senior leaders to go into all of these new areas of disruption and innovation, how does Ken learn? How does Ken understand the complexities of AI, technology disruption, and all of this kind of things that's facing everyone in business today? How do you stay ahead of the curves, so to speak?
You've got to be interested.
Yeah,
You've got, if you're interested in the business you're in, the market you're in, the sector you're in, then a really, really important part of that, particularly when you're in a leadership role, is constantly be thinking, what is what I'm seeing on the news have to do with my business? What am I reading in wherever you're reading it? It can be the Harvard Business Review, the Financial Times, or whatever. And asking yourself, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my business? How can I take advantage of it? How can I make sure it's not a threat? And I've been lucky, particularly when I was at Corn Ferry, and we were right in the middle of the whole internet thing, the .com
yeah,
boom. And back then I was old enough. I was in my mid-30s then, to kind of be senior enough to really be in the middle of everything, and to be part of that decision-making process. I was young enough though to have boundless energy to
yeah,
really
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
subsume myself in all that
yeah.
was going on. But I always knew that at some point that whole .com bubble would burst, and we'd move to a different phase. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I can remember actually even further back, being at Robert Walters in the late 80s, and um, there was a really sharp recession that hit.
Yeah, yeah,
And 87, 88 had been absolute boom years, and then 89 was suddenly a really sharp recession,
yeah.
and no one really saw it coming. And I remember thinking, I don't like that. I don't like not seeing things like that coming. So I think I've always tried to pay attention to that wider context, and that just means, you know, talking to people, having lots of different sources of information, and trying to synthesize it and apply the sort of what does this mean for me question.
Mm, mm. One of the questions I ask people quite often is I'll say, give me an article that you read last time that had an impact. How are you learning? And so when I ask that question, I'm just trying to say we have to be curious. If we want to stay in the game, we have to be curious about
Yeah,
all the implications that come across. Are you following the business news, getting a headline, digging down deeper into that? But when I'm surprised that when I ask that question, I said, well, I do a little here, a little here. They're not even there.
yeah,
Have you?
and right now, um, it's that's always been important, but it's never been more important,
Yeah,
because the impact that technology and particularly AI is having on not just the world of work but society more widely
yeah.
is on a kind of scale and pace that I've never seen before.
It's
You know,
it's at warp speed. I mean,
yeah.
it's at warp speed. So if one of the questions I always like to ask, if you could go back and give your younger self a piece of advice, you've made some fantastic changes. You stay grinding with the band, though the band was there as the anchor. What advice would you give yourself, if you have any advice to give yourself?
Yeah, I think just don't always rush. I mean, I a lot of people struggle with change. I've always had the opposite problem. I'm too willing to change and change fast. So I would have. I literally did some profiling on this a number of years ago, and I was like top 3 or 4%, of people
Okay.
that
Yeah.
just want to see change, and
Yeah.
that can be very exciting, very interesting, but it can be quite harmful as well.
Mm.
And I think just dialing back that needle a little bit, so don't be in the top 5%, maybe be in the top 20%,
Yeah. Be cool at that spot. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, and certainly for a long time, I was just always in a hurry,
Mm.
which I mean, I must have been a nightmare to manage. Really, but I was. So I think a little bit about that, just
Yeah.
learning how to kind of pace things a little bit differently.
But it worked. I mean, you said you were a nightmare to manage. Lots of times you manage people and you can see something that's there, and it's not going to be the normal person that you're managing. I look upon that as that's your leader's perspective. How do you coach? How do you just listen sometimes, as opposed to step one? Here's what you do here. Here's what you do here because this is what I did. No, 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 no. You listen to that person, and you
Yeah,
can.
yeah, and I think that's where I had a great manager that I kind of synced with. It was amazing, and then when I didn't, uh, it was the opposite of that. And I remember actually, again, going back to my time at Corn Ferry. I mean, they did a full day's profiling
Oh, okay.
before you joined the business, and it was yeah, it was really in depth. And at the end of it, the summary of this psychologist was, look, 85 and 90% of the time, your style is going to be really effective in Corn Ferry.
Yeah.
But that 10%
Yeah.
will be catastrophic if you don't manage it. It
Mm.
won't just be bad; it will be, really bad. And that was, and he was right, because there were people in that business back then that were very set in their ways.
Yeah. I love the way you paused, was trying to get the correct words to use.
Yeah. Um, and when I bumped into people like that, it was
Yeah.
bad. I wouldn't be respectful. I would, it
Yeah.
would be a bad relationship. So, learning how to manage that was actually, another, really
Mm.
useful bit of advice.
Okay. So looking back in your career and all the bouncing around, left turns, right turns, U turns, and all of that, what are you most proud of? If you had to choose one or two, what are you most proud of? Because you made some strong decisions. You were facing things, and you made some strong decisions. What are you most proud of?
I think, I mean, obviously, there's talent partners now, which maybe we'll come on to, which I'm incredibly proud of. But I think before that, there were a few things, but there was one in particular, and there was a business called Morgan McKinley, which is where I went after Corn Ferry, and that was a small recruiting firm, and had some kind of issues. It had lost its way a little bit, but at the core of it, there was still a good business. And they had a team that I was able to work with, and we created something really special.
Mm,
In terms of every metric, in terms of employee engagement, customer satisfaction, financial metrics, value creation, just every, if you take that balanced scorecard, after 2 or 3 years, we were just, A plus in all of those. And it went from quite a difficult place to work to an absolute joy to work with. And when I was chairman, and when I moved on, and the guy who had moved up to be chief executive took it on, it went on to be, even bigger, and even more successful.
mm,
So, that was um, that was my first private equity deal. It was being able to kind of, do stuff in, for example, we did a customer development program. And in lots of organizations, they find it really hard because people say, what does this mean for my commission? But
yeah.
that team just said, no, let's work for what's best for the customer, and
Okay.
we'll kind of
Pretty good.
trust the leadership to do
Yeah.
what's right. And then after 6 months, they saw that happening, and it just became,
Okay.
fulfilling. So that was a great, a great
Okay.
example.
Okay. So tell us about Taliant Partners. I've worked with you before. You asked me to do a keynote. I did a keynote
Yeah,
years ago on your
very
session,
good.
and then we had the black tie session. I had a chance to put on a tuxedo and all this kind of thing. Great, a great event. Tell us about Taliant Partners. What's the
So
focus?
the focus is really around helping everyone in that talent ecosystem. So that's employers, it's staffing firms, outsourcing companies, and talent technology businesses, helping them to make better decisions about how employers find and keep the people they need. So that's been the mission, if you like, up until now. I think that's evolving a little bit. But that's really been the mission now, and we do that through delivering content and kind of events, which tend to be quite kind of interactive, almost kind of workshops. In fact,
Yeah,
not almost workshops. Some of them
yeah,
are workshops,
yeah.
and then awards and membership. So we've got different ways of engaging with our community. And we're a commercial business. I mean,
Yeah.
it's got a kind of commercial focus to it, but the mission is really helping to make people make better decisions
Yeah. Yeah.
about the people that they're hiring, what they're doing with them once they've got them, and just making the world of work, less efficient. And going back to your stat earlier about 40% of hires,
Yeah.
don't work, but just trying to make everyone as good as they can be in delivering that outcome.
I want to go back to John just posted. He says, "Are you seeing the white collar recession in your practice? Managers and executives, if you could pull that up, it says managers and executives in the U.S. are struggling to find new senior positions. The time to hire sequence is extended out to 8 to 14 months." Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're going through a real shift. We're if I contrast it back to the .com time, all right. So that was a time of kind of a lot of change, a lot of excitement, and people were running towards it because generally speaking, the economy was in a good shape.
Yeah.
And now what we've got is a new technology that is more disruptive, and it's coming at us faster and and on a bigger scale. And actually, the economy is not in good shape. Okay,
Yeah.
it's really kind of struggling, and this is before obviously events of the last few days, which
Yeah.
don't help. But even before then, it's been a challenge. So you're seeing two things happening at the same time. A weak or kind of stagnant economy, and then a lot of change, and it means organizations will just be nervous about hiring.
Yeah.
And that's not just white collar. That's right across the organization.
Mm.
I think they're looking for some economic certainty, and then they're going to be looking at what role do robotics and AI play in the roles that they're going to hire going forward.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure it is complex now because you can't pick up a business article unless they're talking about the AI piece, the technology piece, how it's moving and moving. a skill set for a senior executive that may not be there. So when I ask the question about how you're learning, you have to stay up. You have to stay on top of all of
Yeah,
that if you're planning on
yeah.
staying in the game. Yeah.
Yeah, you absolutely do. And one of the campaigns that we would like to get a bit of momentum behind is within companies is to make learning cool, right?
Mm.
So we had this at one of our conferences last month, and there were 200 people in the room, and we said, okay, how many of you have a employee of the month? And about 60-70% put their hand
Yeah.
up. And I said, well, who's got a learner of the month? And no hands.
What was that?
Learner, do you have a learner of, and celebrate someone learning something and
Okay.
obviously being able to demonstrate the value
Okay.
of it within the organization. Because everyone's talking about skills and how
Yeah.
do we build skills, evolve skills, identify new skills.
Mm.
But until we start making that part of the DNA of an organization,
Yeah. The communication of
yeah. And one of the ways would be, right, well, we don't have a salesperson of the month. We have, the learning person of the month, and you start to celebrate, innovation in a much more structured and regular way. And it's
yeah.
things like that, I think, that will help to move the agenda. I mean, that's a relatively trite example, but it's a good indication of how much organizations value their skills development.
Yeah, I read an article years ago. I think it's Atlassian. They're located out of Australia. Every month they have so-called I'm going to paraphrase. It's the dumbest idea of the month, and they celebrate that.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
they celebrate that in the context of keep trying. It's okay, and it's kind of an award they give to whatever it is, and everybody sits there and they laugh because what they're trying to tell the workforce is that come up with ideas.
Mm.
Sometimes it's not going to work, but you keep trying to do that. And I
Yeah,
followed this company Atlassian. They're doing some things that's just kind of totally out of the box thinking as about trying to design and redevelop a workforce, the whole thinking of a workforce of 1,200, 1,500 people.
yeah.
And that kind of sinks into exactly what you were talking about.
But they should go even further, and rather than they take the salespeople off to Vegas or Hawaii, or do that with your learning people. You know what I mean? And start to really put
Uh,
some
yeah,
money behind it. And guess what? You'll find people pay a lot more attention to learning if
yeah,
there's a trip to Hawaii at the end of it.
yeah. Totally different.
Yeah.
Um, what are you most excited about going forward?
So I'm uh, excited and nervous in equal measure about the impact of AI. Yeah,
Okay.
um, I think it is the biggest shift that I've ever seen in my time uh, on the planet. Never mind just in work. I think the implications for society are potentially truly profound. I think the impact on the world of work will be
Yes.
truly profound.
Yes.
Um, I worry that our politicians are not paying as much attention to this as they should be.
Yeah.
I don't know that they'll have the answers, but they should at least be paying attention to it. I'm sure some are, but I just don't get the sense that it's as much of a priority
Yeah.
as it needs to be. But having said all that, the opportunities that it opens up are beyond our imagination, and that's the really exciting bit.
Yeah.
How can we really face into that? Learn, apply it, deploy it. Do it in a kind of ethical and fair way,
Mm.
because um, that there will be some very powerful models that come along around fraud and
Yeah.
candidate identification fraud and all sorts of things
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
have real power to do damage. So I think the good ideas need to get ahead of it quickly.
Okay, cool. For the people that are listening, you can follow Taliant Partners. I put links in every post that we had. Click on them.
Thanks.
The knowledge, the advisory is here, and reach out to them as a result. So I wanted to do a shout out for our frequent listeners, Peter Piccinini, who his career started in arts. managing Broadway plays,
Mhm.
and now he's into wealth management. So one of the keys we look for is that your journey. John Self, newspaper reporter, moving up into the editorial business or whatever, and now he's in executive search. Jim Moore, my neighbor in Saudi Arabia, he doesn't like for me to say it. He's a big shot attorney in D.C., in Washington, D.C., for a trade organization. And we have Izia Khatun, who says nice and really appreciated the advice and everything. So as we close out, I always give everyone an opportunity as we close out. The goal of the show is to talk about these trajectories because it's not linear. You come out of school,
Yeah, yeah.
nope, that doesn't work that way anymore. So, what advice would you, some closing thoughts that you want to give to the audience as it relates to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, you raised some interesting points there. I remember back in my Fidelity days, I had dinner with the chief investment officer of Fidelity. We were over at INSEAD, the business school, doing
Yeah,
some
yes.
MBA hiring. And we were having dinner with some MBAs, and one of them said to this guy who'd been voted the third most powerful person in America because of the amount of funds that he. And they said, "What's your favorite undergrad degree for a fund manager?" And I'm sure, they thought he would say, maths or computer science, and he said, no, history. I like people with history degrees because a rigorous history degree, helps you spot patterns, spot the antecedents, build rigorous arguments, for and against. And that was quite surprising to a lot of people. And fast forward to the event I mentioned last month, there's a woman called Dr. Margaret Heffernan, who's a very well-known speaker in the UK, and she gave this fantastic closing keynote about the importance of arts degrees in today's environment, because the creativity and original thinking are going to be way more important than for the last 20 or so years we've celebrated the geeks, the kind of computer science guys, and that's that's fine, but we're in a different phase now where I think we need to really start looking at the creatives, the people that are able to make decisions without any data because they can just sense something or feel something, and be out ahead of where the rest of us are. So I think that would be something I'd encourage people to think about, because I think that's going to be much more important.
Okay, Ken, thank you so much for making time for us. Um, and you brought a wealth of knowledge to the show. I want you to hang on as we begin to close out because there's some things I want to mention to you offline. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Share, like, and subscribe to our channel. We're growing, and it's kind of a leadership masterclass every Friday morning. So thanks everyone, and Ken, I'll talk with you just a bit.
Thank you.
Take the CEO series with you anywhere, anytime. All episodes are now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and major streaming platforms. It's not just an interview. It's a masterclass in leadership.